The final number was a whisper, but it landed like a guillotine. Across the polished mahogany table, Julian Croft watched the color drain from his rival's face. He felt no victory, no remorse, only the clean, cold satisfaction of a problem solved. He had just acquired a legacy, dismantled a family's dream, and all it had cost him was a fraction of his empire. As he walked out, leaving financial ruin in his wake, he wondered if there was a price high enough to make him feel anything at all. He was about to find out. The Croft Holdings building rose from the heart of Chicago like a needle of glass and steel, piercing the gray clouds of a November afternoon. On the 90th floor, Julian Croft looked down on the city below. The rushing cars were silent streaks of light, the scurrying people nothing more than anonymous specks. He found a certain peace in this detachment. A melodic but insistent chime broke the tightly controlled stillness of his office. For the 6th time that morning, the name Leo flashed on his phone screen. With a sigh that carried the exasperation of a king being disturbed, Julian swiped to answer. His voice emerged, devoid of warmth. Leo. This requires an exceptional explanation. Jules. My friend. My savior. Leo's voice came through, carrying that familiar tone that always preceded trouble. I am in desperate need of a huge favor. Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. He and Leo had known each other since their university days, but sometimes he wondered how they remained friends. While Julian had built a multi-billion-dollar financial empire through discipline and sacrifice, Leo seemed determined to pursue every pleasure life offered. I don't have time for favors. The Shanghai acquisition is at a critical stage. Please, man, just hear me out, Leo pleaded. Remember that girl I told you about? Amelia? Well, she wants to bring her roommate to dinner tonight, and I promised I'd find someone to join for her. The answer is a definitive no, Julian said flatly. Find someone else. There is no one else. Everyone I know is either married or out of town. It's just one dinner, Jules. 4 hours. Max. I really like this girl. Julian glanced at the stack of reports awaiting his review. The Shanghai deal would cement Croft Holdings' dominance in the global market. He had spent 3 years pursuing it. I'm busy. You're always busy, Leo countered. When was the last time you did anything besides work? Ever since Isabel. Don't. Julian cut him off, his voice suddenly cold, sharp as a shard of ice. Do not say her name. A tense silence hung between them. Finally, Leo spoke, his voice gentler. Just this once. I'll never ask for another favor again. Julian knew that was a lie. Leo would always need another favor. But perhaps a few hours away from the office would clear his head. Fine. Send the address. You're the best, Jules. Wear something nice but not too intimidating. And for God's sake, try to smile. Julian hung up without another word. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched the city below. He had once been a part of that crowd. A young man full of ambition, who believed in things like love and destiny. That naive young man had died the day Isabel left, taking his ability to trust with her. At 35, Julian Croft had everything money could buy, and nothing that truly mattered. And he had accepted that reality. Hours later, Julian's black sedan glided to a stop in front of Ethelgard. The restaurant's name was exquisitely carved on a brass plaque, its warm interior light casting an inviting halo onto the sidewalk, which was beginning to collect a thin layer of snow. Julian signaled to his driver. "Wait here, David. I won't be long." He stepped out of the car, the cold air immediately seeping through his expensive cashmere overcoat. He hated these social arrangements. They were a waste of time, a theater of smiles and platitudes. His plan was simple: show up, be coldly polite, and find a legitimate reason to leave in under an hour. Just as his hand touched the heavy wooden door of the restaurant, a discordant sound cut through the quiet. A woman's voice, firm but trembling slightly from the cold. "I'm certain I gave you a 20. The fare was $14. Julian turned. Under a streetlight not far away, a small argument was unfolding between a young woman and a taxi driver. At first, he felt a flicker of annoyance. This mundane, street-level chaos was an intrusion into his already undesirable evening. But then he watched. The woman stood tall, though her coat looked unequal to the Chicago chill. Her breath formed white clouds in the air. There was no weakness in her posture, only a resolute indignation. "Lady, I got a 5. The driver replied, his tone gruff. "That's impossible. It was my last 20. Please. I need the change." The desperation in her voice, though masked, was palpable to his trained ear. Julian found himself walking toward them. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the instinct of a man accustomed to solving problems efficiently. Inefficiency annoyed him. "Is there a problem?" His voice was low and calm, but it carried a weight that made both parties turn. The woman looked up at him. And for a moment, Julian's universe seemed to pause. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, like moss in an ancient forest, framed by dark lashes now flecked with snowflakes. Her face, free of elaborate makeup, possessed an honest, unpolished beauty. It was a face that did not belong in his world, where everything was calculated and polished to perfection. "This ain't your business, mister," the cabbie grumbled. Julian ignored him. He withdrew his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill, and handed it to the man. "Consider the matter settled." The driver's attitude changed instantly. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The taxi sped off, leaving a sudden silence. "You didn't have to do that," the woman said, clutching her purse tighter. "But, thank you. I'll find a way to pay you back." In Julian's world, no one insisted on paying back such a small sum. They would have taken it for granted. This woman's pride was unexpected. "That won't be necessary," Julian replied, his eyes still studying her face. There was something refreshing about her. No artifice, no calculation. Just honesty and a quiet dignity, despite her obvious financial struggles. "I'm Clara," she said, offering her gloved hand. "Clara Morgan." Julian Croft. He took her hand, and surprised by the warmth that traveled up his arm from the simple contact. "Well, Julian Croft," Clara said with a small smile that lit up her entire face. "Now I owe you $86. Her precision almost made him laugh. "Are you meeting someone?" he asked, nodding toward Ethelgard. Clara's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, actually. A blind date. My roommate's idea. I tried to tell her I don't have time for dating, but she insisted. A strange coincidence prickled at the back of Julian's mind. Your roommate, he said slowly, wouldn't happen to be named Amelia, would she? Clara's green eyes widened. Yes. How did you know? Before Julian could respond, his phone vibrated with a text from Leo. Running late. Traffic is awful. Stall the girls if you get there first. Julian looked at Clara again, but this time in a completely new light. This was his date. The roommate. This was absurd. Leo would never set him up with someone like this. Leo knew the type of women Julian escorted. Models. Sophisticated heiresses who understood the rules. No emotional entanglements. No expectations. Clara Morgan was different. She radiated sincerity and warmth. Dangerous qualities for a man who had walled off his heart. He put his phone away, looking directly into her eyes. I believe, he said, his voice an even, unreadable tone, that I am your blind date. Confusion flickered across Clara's green eyes, quickly replaced by stark disbelief. And finally, a flush of pink that spread across her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment. The man who had just witnessed her most vulnerable and humiliating moment was the very billionaire her friend had described as stuffy and work-obsessed. Julian observed this cascade of emotions with a sharp focus. He was used to reading people in boardrooms. But this was not a negotiation. This was raw, unfiltered truth. But Amelia said you were. She began, then trailed off, clearly rethinking her words. That I was a bore who needed to get out more? Julian finished for her, a hint of self-mockery in his tone. That's a reasonably accurate summary. A sharp gust of wind blew past, making Clara shiver. Without thinking, Julian instinctively moved closer, his tall frame shielding her from the cold draft. The gesture was so natural it surprised even him. Shall we go inside? He suggested. Clara bit her lower lip, a nervous gesture that drew Julian's attention. I should warn you. I don't belong in places like this. Places with more than one fork on the table tend to intimidate me. Her candor, again, startled him. It was like a breath of fresh air in his suffocating world. Tonight, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. You belong wherever you choose to be. Inside Ethelgard was another world. A symphony of understated elegance. Soft lighting, pristine white tablecloths, and the gentle murmur of civilized conversation. Julian watched Clara as she took it all in, her eyes wide. But he saw more than just wonder. He saw a self-consciousness, a sense of being an imposter in a foreign play. He could see it in the way she held her purse like a shield, in the slight tension in her shoulders as the maitre d' led them to a private table near the window. Just as they were seated, both of their phones buzzed in unison. A text from Leo for Julian, and one from Amelia for Clara. They looked at each other across the table. A silent, mutual understanding. Let me guess, Julian said, his voice dry. They're not coming. Clara nodded, a smile of both resignation and amusement on her lips. Amelia says her sister is having a fashion emergency that requires immediate intervention. This was a setup, Julian realized, irritation beginning to build in his chest. His plan for an early exit was evaporating. I'm sorry, Clara said, placing her napkin on the table and preparing to stand. I should go. This is obviously not what you signed up for. Her pride would not allow her to stay in a situation where she felt like a burden or an object of pity. Wait. The word came out before Julian could think. His plan was to leave. His logic told him this was the perfect escape. But he didn't take it. He looked at her. The woman with the steadfast green eyes and the simple but elegant dress, who had insisted on paying him back $86. The evening had ceased to be a predictable liability. It had become an intriguing anomaly. "We're already here," he heard himself say. "The wine is excellent. Why waste a reservation at Ethelgard?" Clara hesitated, then slowly settled back into her chair. "Are you sure? I mean, we're hardly compatible." The word incompatible hung between them. He, with his inherited wealth and self-made empire. She, with her teacher's salary and compassion as her greatest asset. "Perhaps," he said, surprising himself, "that's exactly why we should stay. A brief respite from our usual worlds." The sommelier arrived, and Julian ordered an expensive bottle of Bordeaux without a glance at the list. He saw Clara subtly clench her hands under the table. After the ritual of tasting, Julian watched her take a small sip, her eyes closing for a moment in appreciation. "It's wonderful," she said. "Though I should confess, my expertise in wine extends to red and white, with a specialty in whatever's on sale." For the second time that evening, Julian laughed. A real, somewhat rusty laugh. Honesty is refreshing, in a world where everyone has suddenly become a wine expert. "Oh, I'm brutally honest," Clara replied, her fingers toying with the stem of her glass. "Amelia says it's a character flaw. She's always trying to improve me." "And what do you think?" Julian asked, his curiosity now entirely genuine. Clara considered the question. "I think happiness isn't about aiming higher, but about finding meaning in what you have. I love teaching. Watching children discover the world. Their faces when they sound out a new word. That's everything to me." Julian studied her, searching for any sign of artifice. There was none. In his world of predators and social climbers, Clara Morgan was an exception. A person without a hidden agenda. "That's admirable," he said finally. "To find such satisfaction in your work." "And what about you, Julian?" Clara asked, her green eyes seeming to see right through his armor. "Do you find meaning in your work? Or is it just about the bottom line?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. The women he dated asked about his yacht, his vacations. They never probed his soul. "Croft Holdings employs over 50,000 people globally," he answered carefully, a prepared response. "Their livelihoods depend on my decisions." Clara tilted her head slightly. "That's the CEO's answer. I was asking about Julian." Before he could formulate a response, his mind went blank. How long had it been? How long had it been since anyone had asked about Julian? How long had it been since he had even asked himself that question? Her question hung in the space between them, more potent than any expensive wine. And for the first time in years, Julian Croft felt completely and utterly unguarded. Clara's question hung in the air, simple yet profound. A reflex honed in 1,000 boardrooms allowed Julian to regain control. He offered a slight, non-committal smile and expertly deflected. "That's a big question, Clara. Perhaps one to save for a third date," he said, his tone even. For now, tell me about those kids. Which one is your biggest challenge? And she did. Julian, the man whose attention span lasted mere minutes for anyone not generating a profit, listened. He listened as she told him about a boy named Sam who had refused to speak for the first 6 months of school and now wouldn't stop asking questions. He heard about a little girl named Maya who secretly drew gardens on the inside of her backpack with crayons. He found himself drawn into her world. A world measured not in market share, but in small, human breakthroughs. The 1-hour exit plan evaporated. When he finally walked her to her waiting cab, the snow was falling more heavily, and the city of Chicago seemed to have fallen silent. On the ride back to his empty penthouse, the city lights blurred past the window. But Julian didn't see them. His mind was consumed with a new equation. Clara Morgan. He was used to women, especially women like Isabel, creatures of calculated grace, practiced smiles, and skillfully hidden ambitions. Isabel had turned charm into a weapon. Clara was different. Her charm was in her complete lack of it. She had no weapons, only truth. Her truth about wine, about forks, about her fears and her joys. It was both unsettling and strangely magnetic. 3 days later, Julian was sitting in a conference room, surrounded by his vice presidents. They were discussing marketing strategy for the next quarter. Figures in the millions of dollars were displayed on the screen. And if we reallocate the budget from the European market, a VP was saying, we can increase our presence in Asia. But Julian wasn't listening. His mind had drifted to an image of a little girl secretly drawing gardens with crayons. He wondered what color the flowers were. Mr. Croft? The VP's voice pulled him back to reality. Your thoughts on this? Julian blinked, annoyed at his own lapse in focus. He was the one who controlled the game, not a daydreamer. Double the budget for Asia, he commanded decisively. Meeting adjourned. As the room cleared, his assistant, Margaret, approached. Sir, the Robinson Foundation called again about the charity gala on Saturday night. They were hoping you would reconsider attending. Julian usually declined these invitations. He preferred to donate anonymously. But something prompted him to ask, what is the cause? Children's education, sir, Margaret replied, looking surprised at his interest. They fund programs in underprivileged schools. Children's education. Secret gardens. It was a perfect, logical pretext. A rational reason to do something entirely irrational. Accept the invitation, Julian said. Then, he did something he hadn't done in years. He made a call himself. A short, somewhat awkward call to Leo to get Clara's number. He stared at the number on his screen for a long moment before pressing the call button, feeling an unfamiliar flicker of hesitation. Her voice came on the line, slightly cautious. Hello? Clara, it's Julian Croft. The silence on the other end lasted a moment too long, enough for Julian to feel a rare uncertainty. Julian, she finally said, surprise evident in her tone. I didn't think I'd hear from you again. I thought that as well, he admitted. That's why I'm calling. There's a charity gala on Saturday night. For children's education. I thought, you might want to attend. With me. Another pause. A charity gala, she said slowly. That sounds very fancy. I'm not sure I have anything appropriate in my closet. Julian's reflex was to solve the problem. "That can be arranged." "No," she replied instantly, her voice a little cooler. "I don't need you to buy me clothes, Julian." He immediately recognized his mistake. "I apologize," he said, hating his own presumption. "That was thoughtless of me." Her sigh was audible over the phone. "It's okay. But you should know, I'm not looking for a benefactor. If we're going to explore whatever this is, it needs to be as equals." "Understood," Julian said, respecting her principles, even as he wondered how they would navigate the reality of their vast financial differences. "So, will you come?" he asked. "As my equal?" Her laugh softened the tension. "Yes, I'll come. I'll find something suitable to wear. I'll pick you up at 7. After hanging up, Julian stood looking out at the city. He had voluntarily stepped into an unpredictable situation, guided by something other than logic. Control was slipping from his grasp. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't entirely mind. Precisely at 7 on Saturday evening, the black sedan pulled up outside Clara's modest building. Julian stepped out, adjusting the bow tie at his collar. He was used to preparing for multi-million-dollar events, yet he found himself feeling an unfamiliar anticipation, a sensation he could neither quantify nor control. When Clara emerged from the main door, for a moment, Julian forgot how to breathe. He had seen beauty before. Beauty sculpted in gyms, honed by stylists, and displayed like a trophy. Isabel's beauty had been a cold, perfect work of art. But this was something else. Clara wore a simple, deep blue silk dress, with no jewelry aside from a pair of small pearl earrings. Her hair was swept up, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. Her beauty didn't come from the dress. It emanated from within. The dress merely framed the warmth and intelligence that shone from her eyes. For the first time, Julian wasn't just looking at an attractive woman. He was truly seeing her. "You look," she said, then smiled, "like you own half the city." "Thank you," he replied, his voice deeper than usual. "And you look magnificent." "Thank you," she said back with a slight blush. "Amelia lent me the dress. She insists it's a fashion tragedy from last season, but I think it still works." "The real tragedy," Julian said, offering his arm, "would be if you weren't wearing it tonight." The gala was being held at the Art Institute of Chicago. As they ascended the grand staircase, Julian felt the stares of the crowd. He was accustomed to attention, but tonight, it felt different. It felt invasive. He felt a primal instinct rise within him, an urge to shield Clara from the assessing, predatory gazes of his world. It was not the thought of a CEO, but of a man. "Everyone's looking at us," Clara whispered, her voice a little nervous as they entered the grand hall, where the works of masters silently witnessed the ostentatious display of Chicago's elite. "They're looking at you," Julian corrected, "because you outshine everyone else here." He introduced her to business associates, and watched with a quiet amusement as she, rather than being intimidated, charmed them with her genuine enthusiasm for education. When she engaged a senator's wife in a passionate discussion about the importance of early reading, Julian felt an unfamiliar surge of pride. "That girl is delightful," remarked Mrs. Blackwood, a formidable society matron and an old friend of Julian's grandfather, as she appeared at his side. refreshingly authentic. Where have you been hiding her? We met recently, Julian said carefully. Mrs. Blackwood's shrewd eyes narrowed. Well, a vast improvement on your usual type. Hold on to this one, Julian. Before he could reply that Clara wasn't his to hold on to, she had swept away. Julian scanned the room for Clara and found her in a deep conversation with the Foundation's director. He was making his way toward them when a familiar voice, smooth as silk but cold as ice, stopped him. Julian, hello. You look as wonderful as ever. He turned slowly. Isabel Bennet. Flawlessly beautiful. As if she'd just stepped off a magazine cover. Isabel. He acknowledged, his voice cool and distant. He felt nothing. Not the old pain. Not anger. Just a cold emptiness where strong emotion once resided. She was like a beautiful statue from a former life. A life that was no longer his. I just flew in yesterday, she said, her practiced smile not reaching her eyes. Richard and I separated last month. I thought perhaps you'd heard. I hadn't, he said simply. Isabel stepped closer, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. I've been thinking a lot, Jules. About us. About mistakes. Is everything all right? Clara's voice was calm, but Julian could see the tension in her posture. Isabel's gaze swept over Clara, assessing and dismissing her in a single glance. And you are? Clara Morgan, she answered with quiet dignity. And you must be Isabel. Isabel's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. So my reputation precedes me. Really, Julian? She turned back to him. A schoolteacher. How quaint. The condescension in her tone made Julian's jaw tighten. Clara teaches kindergarten at one of the schools benefiting from tonight's gala, he said pointedly, his voice carrying an unmistakable protective edge. Her work actually matters. Something shifted in Isabel's expression, surprise, perhaps, at the sharpness in his voice. Her eyes narrowed as she looked between them, reassessing the situation. Well, she finally said. An interesting development. As Isabel sauntered away, Julian turned to Clara. I'm sorry about that. Don't be, Clara said, her green eyes searching his face. Are you okay? The genuine concern in her voice touched him surprisingly. Yes, he realized. I am. Before Clara could respond, the Foundation's director tapped a glass for attention, announcing that the program was about to begin. As they took their seats, Julian felt Clara's hand briefly squeeze his, a simple gesture of support that meant more than any words could have. The director spoke about the Foundation's mission before introducing a video. Familiar classroom scenes appeared on the screen. Julian felt Clara tense beside him. That's my class, she whispered, her hand gripping his arm tighter. My students. And then, to Julian's astonishment, Clara herself appeared on screen, reading to a circle of captivated children. When the video ended to enthusiastic applause, the director smiled. And now, I'd like to introduce one of our extraordinary teachers. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Clara Morgan. Julian felt Clara's grip tighten painfully. No. No one told me about this, she whispered, panic evident in her voice. Go, Julian encouraged softly, his voice full of confidence. You've earned this. With visible trepidation, Clara stood up and made her way to the stage. She looked frozen for a moment, staring out at the sea of expectant faces. Then her gaze found Julian. He nodded, a silent, encouraging gesture. And something inside her seemed to settle. As Clara walked to the stage, the spotlight seemed to erase everything else. For a second, she saw only a sea of anonymous faces and felt a cold wave of panic. She was a teacher, not a performer. Her world was one of colorful rugs and children's eyes, not black tie attire and expectant silence. She took a deep breath, and her gaze found Julian in the crowd. He wasn't smiling, but in his look there was a steadfastness, a quiet belief. His nod was an anchor. And then she stopped thinking about the adults in the room. She thought of Sam, and of Maya, and of secret gardens drawn with crayons. "I don't have a prepared speech," she began, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "So I can only speak from the heart. We talk about education, about numbers and budgets. But for me, it's always been about stories. The story of a child who finds his voice through a book about dinosaurs. The story of a new world opening up just because someone took the time to teach them how to put letters together." She spoke for 5 minutes. 5 minutes of unadulterated passion, of unpolished truth. She didn't speak to impress. She spoke to be heard. When she finished, an initial silence was broken by a wave of applause. It was not the polite applause Julian was used to hearing. It was thunderous, and it was real. When she returned to the table, it felt like she was walking in a dream. Julian stood as she approached. He said nothing, but the way he looked at her meant more than any compliment. In his eyes, she saw more than admiration. She saw respect. The dinner and auction continued. Julian was quiet for most of it, but when the auctioneer presented a special item, a first edition of a classic collection of children's stories, he acted. He entered the bidding with a cool determination, outmatching every rival without a moment's hesitation. When the final gavel fell, Clara stared at him, stunned. "You can't," she whispered as the item was brought to their table. "I could not," he replied. "Consider it a donation to your classroom library, where stories actually matter." When they left the Art Institute, the snow had stopped. The city was cloaked in a pristine white mantle, and the air was crisp and silent. Julian's car was waiting, but he found himself reluctant for the night to end. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" he suggested, a question so spontaneous it surprised even himself. Clara nodded, a radiant smile on her face. They walked along the edge of Millennium Park, their footprints the first marks on the fresh snow. The silence between them was comfortable, as natural as breathing. "You know," Julian said finally, stopping under the golden light of a street lamp, "I've spent my entire life building walls." Clara looked at him, waiting. Walls to protect assets, to keep competitors at a distance, and to keep myself safe. He continued, his voice low. "I thought they made me strong. But meeting you, it's like for the first time, someone didn't try to climb over them, but simply showed me there was a whole other world on the outside." He stepped closer. "You make me want to be a better man, Clara." Her eyes shimmered in the lamplight. "I think you've always been better than you believed. You just forgot how to see it." And maybe it was those words, or maybe it was the way she looked at him, as if she truly saw the man he had long since buried. That broke through the last of his barriers. Julian leaned down, closing the distance between them, and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of hurried passion, but of seeking and finding. Soft, tender, and full of a profound longing. The world seemed to stop. Julian felt like he was coming home to a place he never knew he had lost. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. The moment was perfect, fragile and precious. Until his phone rang, its sharp tone brutally shattering the peace. Julian pulled back with a muttered apology. The screen read Shanghai. An emergency. "I have to take this," he said, regret clear on his face. "I understand," Clara said, though a flicker of disappointment crossed her eyes. "Let me at least take you home." "It's all right. Go handle your business." "Absolutely not," Julian insisted. He signaled to David, who had been following them discreetly. As the car pulled up, Julian felt torn. A completely foreign feeling. Julian Croft was never torn. His priorities had always been clear. "I'll call you tomorrow," he promised as he opened the car door for her. "Will you?" she asked, and in her question was something deeper. "I promise," he said firmly. As David's car drove away with Clara, Julian was already pulling out his secure phone, preparing for the call. But he was not prepared for the text that arrived moments later, from an unknown number. Touching scene in the park. "The press will love the photos of Chicago's coldest CEO melting for a schoolteacher. Unless you'd prefer they didn't. 5 million seems fair. Details to follow." Julian stared at the message. The blood in his veins felt as though it had turned to ice. Someone had been watching them. Someone had photographs. Someone was threatening to expose his private life to the world. And more importantly, was threatening to drag Clara into the harsh spotlight that always followed him. In that moment, Julian realized just how dangerous his feelings for Clara Morgan had become. Not just to him, but to her. Julian stood motionless on the empty street. The cold of the November night nothing compared to the chill spreading through his chest. The warmth from Clara's kiss, the feeling of a new possibility, had been annihilated by the cold, calculated words on his phone screen. This was his world. A world where the most beautiful moments could be weaponized, where vulnerability came with a price tag. When he returned to the penthouse, the silence was no longer peaceful, but suffocating. He wasn't angry. Anger was a hot, impulsive emotion. What he felt was colder. It was a controlled, precise, and lethal fury. His first call was to Reynolds, his head of security. "I need the source of a text message. Now." Within the hour, Reynolds was at the penthouse. The report was brief and clear. A burner phone, purchased with cash. But it had been activated from a cell tower near the hotel where Isabel Bennett was staying. Reynolds, a practical man of few words, offered his advice. "This threat stems from your connection to Ms. Morgan. The cleanest solution is to sever the connection. At least until this is resolved." The logic of it was like a knife twisting. It was exactly what the Julian of a week ago would have done. Cut losses. Minimize damage. Protect the asset. She was an uncontrollable variable, an unnecessary risk. But as Julian looked out the window, he didn't see numbers or threats. He saw Clara's steadfast green eyes, saw her smile when he gave her the book, felt her supportive squeeze of his hand at the gala. Pushing her away was no longer a business strategy. It felt like a self-amputation. "No," Julian said, his voice firm. "Find me leverage against Isabel. Everything. Financial. Personal. I want her neutralized." By the next afternoon, he had it. Isabel was in financial trouble after her separation. A single, cold, and decisive call to her ex-husband, a business rival, but a man who also valued discretion, was all it took. The external threat was neutralized with ruthless efficiency. Now came the harder part. The conversation no strategy could prepare him for. They met at a small cafe near Clara's apartment. A place that smelled of roasted coffee and baked goods. The antithesis of the sterile air of his world. Julian wore a simple sweater and jeans, feeling strangely out of place. Clara arrived, bringing the winter chill in on her cheeks. She sat down, her eyes immediately searching his face for answers. "What is it, Julian?" He decided to face it the way she had always faced him, with unvarnished truth. "After you left the other night," he began, his voice even, "I received a blackmail threat. Someone took photos of us in the park." She looked at him, confused. "But we weren't doing anything wrong." "No," he agreed. "But in my position, privacy is a luxury. If those photos were released, the media would dig into your life. They would camp outside your apartment, harass your students' parents. Your classroom, the place you love, would become a circus." Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes, followed by a flash of hurt. She looked down at her hands. "So, you're here to end things, before they really begin." It was the easy path, the logical escape. He didn't take it. "No," he said, his voice firmer. "I'm here to be honest about what continuing might mean. You deserve to make an informed choice." She looked up, pride returning to her eyes. "You think I can't handle it?" "I think you shouldn't have to," he corrected gently. "Your life has real meaning. Clara. My world? It could tarnish that." Clara reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Its warmth seeped through the chill that had enveloped him for 2 days. "Then tell me one thing first," she said, her gaze unwavering, cutting straight to his soul. "This. Whatever is happening between us. Is it real for you? Or am I just a novelty? An authentic schoolteacher who amuses the jaded billionaire?" This was the real question. Not about risk or the media, but about him. About his heart. "It's real," he said, his voice quiet, holding the weight of a long-suppressed confession. "More real than anything I've felt in years. And that's what scares me." Clara's expression softened. "It scares me too. But I've always believed that anything worth having involves risk." Julian's phone buzzed. An email from Reynolds confirming the Isabel situation was permanently resolved. He silenced it. That problem no longer mattered. The real problem was sitting across from him, her hand still on his, offering him a choice that had nothing to do with corporations or money. It was a choice about whether he was brave enough to risk everything for something worthwhile. 6 months later. The air in a kindergarten classroom has a specific scent, a mixture of wax crayons, paste, and the energetic chaos of young minds. Julian Croft, A man accustomed to the smell of rich leather in luxury cars and the crisp scent of $100 bills, found himself surprisingly at home in this world. It was career day at Clara's school. "Mr. Croft," a little girl with tightly wound pigtails asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Are you really Miss Clara's boyfriend?" Julian smiled and crouched down to her level, an act that now felt natural. "Yes, I am. Is that okay with you?" The little girl considered this seriously. "I guess so. But you have to be nice to her. She's the best teacher ever." "I know," Julian agreed, his voice gentle. "And I promise." "Pinky promise?" she asked, holding out her tiny finger. Julian solemnly linked his much larger pinky with hers. "Pinky promise." That evening, their worlds had merged. Julian's penthouse, once a fortress of solitude, was now filled with warm chatter and laughter. They were hosting a fundraiser for an educational initiative Clara had developed, a program that would bring her teaching methods to schools across the city. Clara moved through the crowd of executives and investors, not with the timidity of an outsider, but with the confidence of a woman on a mission. She didn't speak of profits or market share. She spoke of potential, of futures, and she had the most hardened men and women in the room opening their hearts and their checkbooks. Mrs. Blackwood, the formidable society matron, appeared at Julian's side, a glass of champagne in hand. "That girl is remarkable," she observed. "You've done well, Julian. Better than your grandfather ever did." Julian raised an eyebrow. "My grandfather built all of this." "Harold was a brilliant businessman," Mrs. Blackwood said, her gaze distant. "But he was a failure at life. He never understood what you are learning. That success isn't measured by the numbers in a bank account. It's measured by connection, by the legacy you leave in people's hearts." Her words were like a key, unlocking a final room in Julian's soul. He had spent his life chasing his grandfather's definition of success: power, wealth, control. He had feared love because he saw it as a weakness, a risk that could undermine his empire. But as he looked at Clara across the room, her face alight with passion, he realized the truth. Love wasn't a risk to his empire. Love was the empire. It was everything. He realized the feeling he had for her wasn't just admiration, not just attraction, not just companionship. It was simpler and infinitely more profound. He crossed the room, his steps purposeful. He came to her side, gently taking her hand mid-conversation. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice urgent. Clara turned to him, seeing the gravity in his eyes. "I love you, Clara Morgan," he said, the words coming out naturally. "Certainly. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you insisted on paying back $86 in the snow." Tears welled in her green eyes, but her smile was brilliant and dazzling. "I love you too, Julian Croft." At that moment, as if by some cosmic design, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall outside the giant glass windows, just like they had on the night they first met. Julian pulled her close, inhaling her familiar scent. He had spent his life building a kingdom of glass and steel, only to find that his greatest fortune, his most precious treasure, was found in the warm heart of a kindergarten teacher. The cold CEO had melted, not by a successful merger, but by a sweet surrender. A surrender to destiny. The best deal he had ever made.